The ovens at Sweet Beginnings came alive before the sun did, the way they had every single morning for the 6 years Nina Castellano had owned the little bakery on the corner of Fig and Larkspur, and the way they had for the 20 years before that when it still belonged to her mother. Flour dusted the air in a fine, familiar haze as Nina moved through the pre-dawn dark of her kitchen, kneading dough with hands that knew the work so well they barely needed her attention anymore, leaving her mind free to hum along to the radio propped on the flour-dusted shelf above the mixer. She loved this hour more than any other. The street outside was empty and blue-gray with early light, the neighborhood not yet awake enough to remind her of anything she'd rather not think about. Not the credit card statements piling up in a drawer she avoided opening. Not the quiet, persistent ache of being a woman built soft and round in a world that seemed to reward only the sharp angles. Not the small, constant bracing she did every time a customer's eyes lingered a beat too long on her apron before moving to her face. Here, at 4 in the morning, surrounded by the smell of yeast and cinnamon and the low hum of the ovens warming, she was simply herself, and that was enough. By 7, the display case gleamed with croissants and morning buns and the lemon poppy seed muffins that had become, over the years, something of a neighborhood institution. Mrs. Alvarez from the flower shop next door came in for her usual, as she had every morning for 4 years, and Nina wrapped her roll in wax paper without being asked and refused, as always, to take payment for the coffee that went with it. A construction crew working the block over stopped by in a loud, cheerful cluster, teasing each other over the last of the cherry danishes. An elderly man named Walter, who Nina suspected lived alone somewhere nearby, sat at the corner table with the newspaper he never seemed to actually read. Simply grateful, she always thought, for somewhere warm to sit that didn't ask anything of him. This was the life Nina had built for herself out of flour and butter and stubborn, patient love for a shop that had never once made her rich but had, every single day, made her feel like she belonged somewhere. It was, she often thought, more than enough. She had no way of knowing, wiping down the counter at 9:30 that morning, that it was about to be taken from her in the space of about 4 minutes. The black cars pulled up outside a little after 10, 3 of them, gliding to the curb with the kind of quiet, expensive precision that made every window on the block twitch with curtains pulled back an inch. Nina looked up from behind the register as the bell over her door gave a single, cheerful chime that felt, in retrospect, cruelly incongruous with what followed it. The man who walked in first didn't look at the pastry case. He didn't look at the chalkboard menu she'd hand-lettered herself the week before, advertising the new seasonal scone. He looked, instead, directly at her, with an expression so entirely devoid of warmth that Nina felt the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees around him. Dante Moretti was tall in a way that filled a doorway, dressed in a dark coat that probably cost more than her monthly rent, flanked by 2 men who stood near the entrance with their hands clasped in front of them, silent and watchful in a way that made the hair on the back of Nina's neck rise before he'd said a single word. She had heard the name before, the way everyone in this part of the city eventually heard certain names, always in a lowered voice, always followed by a subject change. She had never expected to hear it addressed to her directly. "Nina Castellano," he said, and it wasn't a question. "That's me," she managed, wiping her hands on her apron out of pure nervous habit. "Can I get you something? We have this building, and the 2 on either side of it are being redeveloped," Dante said, cutting through her sentence without any apparent awareness that he'd done so. "Commercial retail, ground floor, luxury residential above. Construction begins in 6 weeks. Nina stared at him, the words arriving without context, without softening, landing in her chest like something physical. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "I don't understand. This is my shop. I own the lease. My mother signed the original. The building owner sold the block to my company 8 months ago, Dante said, already reaching into his coat and producing a folded document, which he unfolded with 2 efficient motions and pressed flat against the front window glass, smoothing it with the flat of his hand as though the gesture itself required no further explanation. You have 30 days. Please, Nina said, and hated the way her voice cracked on the single word. Hated the tears she felt rising and couldn't quite stop. This bakery was my mother's. It's the only thing I have left of her. If there's any way I could pay more rent, I could. Dante's expression didn't shift at all. 30 days, he repeated, already turning toward the door. His men falling into step beside him with the same silent precision they'd entered with. My people will be by to supervise the property inventory at the end of the week. The bell over the door chimed again as they left, the same cheerful sound it always made, obscene now in a way it had never been before. Nina stood behind her counter with the eviction notice taped crookedly to her front window, blocking out half the morning light, and let herself cry for exactly 90 seconds before she made herself stop, because there were still customers who might walk in, and she had never once let anyone see her fall apart behind that counter, and she wasn't about to start now over a man who clearly felt nothing at all. She spent the rest of that morning, numb and mechanical, pulling rolling pins and her mother's old recipe cards off the shelves and folding them into cardboard boxes she'd had to walk 2 blocks to buy, because she didn't own a single box in a shop that had never, in 6 years, needed to pack itself away. She had no idea, taping shut a box of her mother's handwritten cake recipes with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, that less than a mile away, in a black SUV traveling the exact route Dante's convoy always took back toward his estate, a rival family's men had just forced his lead car off the road with a delivery truck, and that in the chaos and gunfire that followed, his 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, small and quick and utterly terrified, had somehow slipped out of a rear door during the confusion and vanished, alone, into a city she had no way of navigating. Dante's phone rang 11 minutes after he'd walked out of Sweet Beginnings, and by the time he answered it, standing on the sidewalk outside his next appointment, the voice on the other end. His head of security, Marcus, breathless, terrified in a way Dante had never once heard from him, delivered 4 sentences that ended every other concern in his life instantly and completely. Convoy ambushed. Marco's people. Sophia is gone. We don't know where she is. What followed was the worst hour of Dante Moretti's entire life. Worse than the day he'd buried his wife. Worse than any war he'd waged or nearly lost in 15 years of running an empire built on violence. He tore through the neighborhood with every man he had, radios crackling, his own voice raw from shouting Sophia's name down alleys and into shuttered storefronts, his mind supplying, unbidden and relentless, every possible horror that could be happening to his daughter in the time it was taking him to find her. Sophia, meanwhile, had run 3 blocks in the wrong direction entirely, sobbing, lost, ducking behind a delivery truck stopped at a red light long enough that her captors, scrambling in the chaos of the ambush, lost track of her completely. She wandered, small and shaking in her school uniform, down a street she didn't recognize, past shuttered shops and indifferent strangers too caught up in their own mournings to notice a crying child, until she saw, glowing warm in gold against the gray afternoon, the lit window of a bakery with a crooked paper sign taped to the glass that she was too young and too frightened to read. She pushed through the door on instinct, the way frightened children are drawn to warmth and light without knowing why, and found herself standing, breathless and shaking, in the middle of a small shop that smelled like sugar and cinnamon, facing a soft, kind-faced woman behind the counter who had just spent the worst morning of her own life packing away everything she owned. Nina took one look at the child, soaked in sweat and rain, her small chest heaving, eyes wide with a terror no 6-year-old should ever have to carry. And every ounce of her own grief simply fell away, replaced instantly by something older and more instinctive than heartbreak. "Hey, hey, it's okay," Nina said, dropping immediately to her knees so she wasn't looming over the girl, keeping her voice low and impossibly gentle. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you in here. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophia," the girl managed between sobs, her whole small body trembling. "There were men. They took me from the car and I ran, and I don't know where my daddy is, I don't know where." Nina didn't ask another question. She simply gathered the child into her arms, felt the frantic hammer of a small heart against her own chest, and carried her back behind the counter, locking the front door with her free hand and flipping the sign to closed without a second thought for the customers she might turn away. She sat Sophia down at the little table in the back kitchen, wrapped a clean apron around her shivering shoulders like a blanket, and pulled a tray of cinnamon rolls out of the warming oven, setting one in front of the girl along with a glass of milk, talking softly the entire time about nothing in particular. The bakery, the smell of the ovens, the silly orange cat that sometimes slept in the window, anything to slow the girl's breathing, anything to give her small mind somewhere safe to land. It took nearly 40 minutes for Sophia's sobs to soften into hiccups, and another 20 before she was calm enough to eat, sitting cross-legged on a flour-dusted stool, describing in halting 6-year-old detail the men who had grabbed her and the mad scramble of her escape, while Nina listened, her own heart breaking with fury on the child's behalf, and quietly, without the girl noticing, dialed the police from the shop's landline, only to be told that a call had already come through from a private security detail canvassing the exact block she was on. She didn't have to wait long after that. The bakery door burst open with enough force to rattle the display case, the small bell above it clattering wildly, and Dante Moretti stood in the doorway with a gun already drawn, his coat soaked through with rain, his face a mask of barely restrained violence that Nina had not seen in him 3 hours earlier, when he'd simply looked cold. This was something else entirely, something raw and desperate and terrifyingly close to breaking. His eyes swept the small shop in half a second, and then found his daughter, sitting safe and sticky with cinnamon sugar on a flour-dusted stool, and something in his entire body seemed to collapse inward all at once. Sophia flew off the stool and across the kitchen, and Dante was on his knees before she reached him, the gun clattering, forgotten, onto the tile floor, both arms wrapping around his daughter with a desperation that made Nina look away out of some instinct toward privacy, toward giving this man who had evicted her from her mother's shop only hours ago, the small dignity of not being watched while he shook apart with relief. "Daddy," Sophia said into his shoulder, her voice muffled and small. "The nice lady saved me. She gave me cinnamon rolls, and she locked the door so the scary men couldn't find me, and she stayed with me the whole time." Dante lifted his head slowly, still holding his daughter, and looked at Nina properly for the first time since walking through the door. Not as an obstacle standing between his company and a piece of real estate, but as a woman who had, in the space of an afternoon, done something for him that his entire empire, his money, his men, his violence, had not been able to do fast enough to prevent from being necessary in the first place. "You," he said, his voice cracking on the single syllable in a way that felt entirely foreign coming from a man who, hours earlier, had delivered an eviction notice without once raising his voice. "I found her wandering outside," Nina said quietly, still crouched near the counter, giving him space to hold his daughter without an audience pressing in too close. "She was terrified. I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Dante said, and something in his expression had shifted so completely from the man who'd walked into her shop that morning that Nina almost didn't recognize him. Most people would have called the police and stayed at a distance. You brought a frightened child into your kitchen and fed her cinnamon rolls until she stopped shaking. He rose slowly, Sophia still clinging to his side, refusing to let go of his hand even now, and crossed the small shop to the front window, where the eviction notice he'd taped there himself that morning still hung crooked against the glass. He looked at it for a long moment, long enough that Nina watched something like shame move visibly across his face, and then, with two sharp motions, he tore it down entirely, crumpling the paper in one fist. "This was a mistake," he said quietly, turning back to face her. "Both this morning and every part of it. You will not be losing this shop, Miss Castellano. Not this week. Not ever, if I have any say in it." Nina didn't quite know how to respond to that, standing in her flour-dusted apron with a rescued 6-year-old still gripping her father's hand, watching the most feared man in the district visibly wrestle with something that looked, for the first time, uncomfortably like guilt. "You don't have to do that because of what happened today," she said carefully. "I don't want charity, Mr. Moretti. I wanted to keep my mother's shop because it's mine. Not because your daughter happened to wander in here at the right moment." "It's not charity," Dante said. "It's correcting an error in judgment I should never have made in the first place." He crouched slightly, meeting Sophia's eyes. "Sophia, can you tell the nice lady thank you properly?" "Thank you, Miss Nina," Sophia said solemnly, still clutching a half-eaten cinnamon roll in one small fist, and something about the earnest, uncomplicated gratitude in the girl's voice finally cracked the last of Nina's carefully held composure, and she found herself crying again, this time for an entirely different reason than she had that morning. By the following afternoon, 2 of Dante's men stood posted permanently outside Sweet Beginnings, quiet and unobtrusive in dark jackets, present around the clock in shifts that never once left the block unwatched. Word moved through the neighborhood quickly, the way it always did, that the bakery on Fig and Larkspur was, as of yesterday, entirely off-limits to any trouble, any inspector, any landlord looking to squeeze a struggling business out of existence, protected now by a name people said only in lowered voices. Dante himself began appearing most afternoons, always with some practical excuse, checking on his security detail, confirming the perimeter, reviewing camera placement with an attention to detail that gradually, over the following 2 weeks, began to feel less like professional diligence and more like a man finding reasons to be somewhere he wanted to be. He noticed things about her that customers rarely did. He noticed the particular, careful way she reorganized the display case every morning so the less popular pastries got equal light and attention, refusing to let anything sit forgotten. He noticed the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, when a customer made an offhand comment about her size, and the quiet, practiced grace with which she absorbed it and kept working anyway. He noticed and eventually said aloud, in a tone that left no room for her to deflect it the way she deflected most compliments, that she carried herself like a woman who had never once been told she was allowed to take up space, and that whoever had failed to tell her that had been catastrophically wrong. "I don't need you to tell me I'm beautiful," Nina said one afternoon, flustered and unused to the direct, unflinching way he looked at her, as though cataloging something he intended to keep. "I'm not telling you anything you don't already know," Dante said. "I'm simply the first person willing to say it out loud in front of you." The guarded trust between them built slowly in small, deliberate increments. A shared coffee after closing, Sophia's visits growing more frequent as the girl developed an outright devotion to the woman who'd hidden her from the scary men. Quiet conversations in the back kitchen while Nina worked dough with her hands, and Dante, increasingly, found himself simply sitting nearby, watching her work, saying very little, needing to say very little. The peace didn't last. It rarely did, in Dante's world, and Nina learned this with brutal speed on a Thursday night 2 weeks later, when she arrived at the bakery before dawn to find her front window shattered. her display case smashed, flour and sugar scattered across the floor like a battlefield, and a single word spray-painted across the back wall in red. A warning, unmistakably, from whoever had noticed exactly what Dante's protection of this shop actually signaled. Marco Baresi, the head of a rival syndicate that had spent the better part of a year probing for weaknesses in Dante's operation, had learned, through channels Dante would later spend considerable time in violence tracing, that the baker who'd sheltered his daughter had become something precious to him, and precious things in Marco's calculation made excellent leverage. Dante arrived within minutes of Nina's panicked call, and the fury that moved through him standing in the wreckage of her shop was colder and far more dangerous than the desperate terror she'd witnessed the day Sophia went missing. This was not a man losing control. This was a man making a decision with terrible calm about exactly how far he intended to go. "Nobody touches what's mine," he said, quiet enough that Nina had to lean in to hear it, and this time, standing amid broken glass and ruined pastries. She didn't correct the word mine the way she might have a month earlier. Over the following days, working alongside Dante's security team, Nina found herself doing something she'd never expected, using the very thing she'd always considered unremarkable about herself, her sharp, near-photographic memory for the small details of neighborhood life, to help piece together exactly where Marco's people were operating from. She remembered a delivery truck that had passed her shop at the same odd hour 3 separate mornings. Remembered a conversation overheard between 2 men outside the hardware store about a warehouse lease on the industrial side of the district. Remembered, with startling precision, the exact make and color of a car that had idled outside her bakery the night before the vandalism. Dante's men, cross-referencing her observations against their own surveillance, found the warehouse within 36 hours. What followed, Dante made clear to her beforehand with the same blunt honesty he'd shown from the very beginning, would not be gentle. Nina, understanding by now precisely what kind of man she had let into her life, did not ask him to spare Marco's operation the way, in some other version of this story, a gentler woman might have. She had watched a 6-year-old girl shake with terror in her kitchen. She had swept broken glass out of the shop her mother built with her bare hands. She wanted this finished. The strike that dismantled Marco's operation 2 nights later was swift, decisive, and entirely successful, ending not just the immediate threat to Nina and Sophia, but the better part of a year-long campaign Marco had been quietly waging against Dante's territory. By the time the sun rose, the rival syndicate that had shattered her front window no longer existed in any organized form, and the block around Sweet Beginnings settled, for the first time in weeks, into something that finally felt like real, lasting safety. Nina found out what Dante had done with the property itself 3 days later, when she arrived at the shop to find the entire commercial square. Every building on the block, including the one she'd once feared losing entirely, quietly transferred in full into her name alone. No conditions. No strings. A deed that made her, in the space of a single legal filing, the sole owner of the entire corner she had once believed she was about to be evicted from. "I don't understand," she said, standing in his office with the paperwork trembling slightly in her hands. "This is, Dante, this is too much." "It's correction," he said simply, the same word he'd used the day he tore the eviction notice off her window. "I took something from you I had no right to take. I am giving back considerably more than I ever should have threatened to remove in the first place." He paused, and something in his usually controlled expression softened into something she'd rarely seen from him. "And because I intend to spend a great deal of time in that bakery for the rest of my life, and I would very much prefer it remain exactly where it is." The grand reopening of Sweet Beginnings, expanded now across the entire block, its windows gleaming and its ovens finally large enough to keep pace with a neighborhood that had, over the past month, come to see the shop as something closer to a landmark than a business, drew nearly the entire district out onto the street on a warm Saturday morning. Mrs. Alvarez brought flowers for every table. Walter, from his usual corner, actually looked up from his newspaper long enough to smile. The construction crew from down the block showed up in force, cheerfully clearing out an entire tray of cherry danishes within the first 20 minutes. Sophia, dressed in a small yellow sundress, spent most of the morning glued to Nina's side, proudly introducing her to every customer who came through the door as my Nina, a title she delivered with such absolute, uncomplicated certainty that nobody in the shop thought to correct her. "Your family now," Sophia announced at one point, tugging on Nina's apron with the same fierce, uncomplicated devotion she'd carried since the day she'd first been found safe on that flour-dusted stool. "Daddy says so too." Nina looked up to find Dante watching them both from across the room, leaning against the newly rebuilt counter with an expression that held none of the cold, closed authority he'd walked in with on the very first day, the day the eviction notice had gone up on this same window. He crossed the shop slowly, stopping close enough that Sophia, satisfied with her introductions, wandered off toward the pastry case to negotiate with one of Dante's guards for a second cinnamon roll. "I once told you I was correcting a mistake," Dante said quietly, watching Nina's face in the warm morning light spilling through her rebuilt front windows. "I think I understated what actually happened that day." "What do you think actually happened?" Nina asked, smiling despite herself. "I think," Dante said, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that would have startled anyone who'd seen him standing over Marco's dismantled operation days earlier. "I walked into this shop intending to take something from you, and I left it, without realizing it yet, having found the only person I have ever wanted to give everything to instead." Outside, the neighborhood moved on in its ordinary Saturday rhythm, unaware that the quiet baker on the corner of Fig and Larkspur had become, in the space of a single terrifying afternoon and the month that followed it, something the entire district would come to understand without ever needing it spoken aloud. The one thing in Dante Moretti's territory that no one, under any circumstances, would ever be foolish enough to threaten again.